Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is the host, I suppose, Craig Trulia, and with me tonight is, I can't pronounce it, Codex Justinianus.
I've been pronouncing it Justinianus. So
Justinianus. Can I just say Justin? That's what I'm going to do. You're just going to be Justin this evening.
You can also just call me Ben. That's my actual name. So.
All right. So Ben is give the big reveal with the face and with the name.
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Now, unlike me, there's no reason to hate on Ben. Ben is just a good old guy. He's like I don't know. He walks in the footsteps of Seraphim Hamilton with biblical exegesis. That's Orthodox. And he really was coming up some real interesting things on the issue of usury. And so I think this is an issue, and I'm going to give a cute little introduction, wait for people to come on about usury. I think this is a really important issue because people don't talk about money. And money is really a big part of our faith. The scriptures talk a lot about money, and particularly about how we ought to use it. God gives us money to be wise stewards, to build his kingdom, to bless others. Money is just a means of exchange for labor, right? So like, I might not be able to grow the food in your backyard to feed you, but I can give you money so you can buy that food for someone else who grew it, right? So money is the means of exchange for labor. Now, this is consistent with a basic economics that capital is labor, right? And so money is just a means of exchange for capital. You can make money whatever you want. It could be gold, it could be silver, it could be tulips if you're in the Netherlands. It could be whatever. It's the agreed upon means of exchange for labor, really, because capital is labor. So usury becomes an issue just logically speaking, because you're not giving someone labor, you're actually giving someone money and charging them interest for the sake of them having money. Hopefully they can use it for something productive, but not necessarily. And so the rule of thumb with usury is that usury is lending the money for interest for non-productive ends. Now, Justin, or Ben, we can call you Ben tonight. Ben is going to go into this in detail, but non-productive ends, payday loans, buying a big screen TV, arguably buying a car, or buying at least a nicer car, buying an SUV, buying a house you can't afford. Those would be non-productive ends. What may it not be? We'll talk about some of these. What may it not be? Let's say you and a bunch of friends are buying a ship, right? You want to do trade with the ship, so you could be in effect buying something and you could be paying interest in order to acquire this so you could conduct business. Probably a more strict analog for something that's productive would be corporate bonds. A company needs to raise funds so they could buy inventory, so they could sell it, make more money, and expand. But you're not just going to give them the money for free. You don't know them. So they're going to pay you interest, but they're not doing it so they could buy a big screen TV or get a hit of meth. They're doing it because they really need to expand their business, and it's a corporate bond.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but it's important to say this from the outset that people have a basic idea that usury is the lending of money and interest for non-productive ends. Now, out of full disclosure, as some people are well aware, I'm ethnically half Jewish because my mother's Jewish, my father's Italian, hence the Italian last name. And for whatever reason, there's a lot of Jewish bankers. I never got the calling card to the Jewish conspiracy, so I don't know why. And my grandfather, who's Jewish, who's now dead, he was a millionaire. So it's like, apparently, maybe you got to be billionaire to get into the Jewish conspiracy crowd. But that aside, there's a lot of Jews in banking. So people, whenever there's a Jewish guy making some sort of passing observation about it, people are automatically very skeptical. I could say this, knowing my mother, knowing myself, having Jewish friends, and I hope people bring this up, but people should know I'm not saying this to be like racist or something, but Jews are obsessed with money. They're usually pretty good with money, and they're usually not destitute. They just always figure out a way to do whatever with the money. It's a stereotype, but it's generally true. And if you know good examples where that's not, leave comments. I'd be actually sincerely interested. Probably my Jewish friends would be as well. But that being said, when it comes to usury and money, it's interesting that God took this interest in the Jewish people, that they would know what's appropriate with this. And as well as so I think that's one thing to take away, knowing that this has to do with Judaism. But also today, it's hard to criticize usury because it's automatically attacked as anti-Semitic. So I think in some ways, I'm the perfect, if I'm not, because you'll be the messenger tonight, Ben. I'm the perfect accomplice because I'm ethnically Jewish. I don't doubt the Holocaust occurred, and all sorts of other stuff that people ascribe to Jews. But that aside, it's because it's tied to anti-Semitism, people can't criticize it. And they can't criticize the ramifications of usury on society and spiritually speaking. In fact, in the Handbook of Faith, Hope, and Love by St. Augustine said there's a real danger that something that's sinful will become so accepted by society that nobody will see it as sinful anymore. They'll actually think it's good. So you'll hear your church just took out a loan to expand its whatever hall, where they take me or whatever. You go, oh, that's great, right? Or you just invested in a microfinance firm and go, oh, look, this helps people overseas to expand their little bodegas or whatever, and you'll be real proud of yourself, but you're not realizing you kind of bought into that usury is just part of life. And this will be my introduction to Ben. Tell me if I'm wrong, but Ben's interest in this, people will say, the Orthodox Church is not the true church because they've changed their stance on faith and morals. They once took a firm stance against usury, and now they're usurers like everybody else, right? And that is a serious challenge because anyone with half a brain should realize that usury is sinful. It's spoken about consistently sinful in the scriptures and the fathers. Mm-hmm. And so, all right, where does that leave us today as Christians? Where does that leave the Orthodox Church today? So all interesting stuff. End of introduction long enough. So Ben, it's great to have you here today to talk about, give us a preview of a future article I'm sure you'll be having at ancientinsights.wordpress.com. So Ben, tell me a little bit how you got interested in this topic specifically, and then we'll start taking it from there.
Well, thank you for the introduction. It was, it really was reading the Psalms that got me interested in this, I should say. Recently, I have a lot of Psalms that are part of my prayer rule, and I recently just added Psalms 9 through 15 in the Septuagint. And Psalm 14, obviously, you and I have been going back and forth about St. Basil's commentary on Psalm 14. When I get to Psalm 14, I always, every night, I'm reading this condemnation of usury. I forget what the exact quote is, but it basically says something about, the guiles of usury and how evil it is. And I've heard people talk about usury before. Obviously, I've taken history classes, so I know the whole thing with the Jews could do usury, but Christians couldn't in the Middle Ages, and that caused a lot of conflict and all of that. I know I'm heavily simplifying there, but most people are familiar with that basic history. But I never really looked into it until just recently. And then the more I looked into it, the more, for me, whenever I look into a topic that's related to the Bible, I don't just try to look for the proof text and just say, okay, here's this text, it says this, moving on. But I try to look at it more in the broader context of what is this telling us about the whole counsel of what God has revealed to us in his word, and how has this been interpreted by the fathers and by the church. And so that's sort of the angle that I come at it from. Obviously, like you mentioned, I come at it from more the biblical perspective, and I know that you're much more well versed in the fathers than I am, although I do my best to try and keep myself up to speed on what they say about any particular topic I'm looking into. But that's kind of the approach I'm going to be taking on usury tonight. So, yeah.
So, the read, and maybe, should I be a real presenter tonight? Let me share screen and show Psalm 14 in the Septuagint. And he has not lent his money on usury and has not received bribes against the innocent. He that does these things shall never be moved.
Yeah.
Right? So God will give grace to those who are not usurers, right? They're not lending for interest. And so let me ask you this then. All right. Usury is a sin. Okay. So is that just an Old Testament thing? Could you give us like a review of the whole scriptures of what the scriptures teach about usury?
Yes, definitely. So the first time that we really hear about usury, I believe, is in Exodus chapter 22. And so Exodus 22 says, "If you lend money to my people that are poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them." And now, like a lot of the laws given in Exodus, it's not just that law, but then later on in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, especially, Moses sort of clarifies more so what these laws mean. So I think of it similar to the second commandment's prohibition on idolatry, or on making graven images, right? At first, it appears to be a very broad general condemnation on any forms of it, but then obviously Moses goes on and explains what it means in the book of Deuteronomy. And so likewise, this happens also in the book of Leviticus. So the condemnation on usury is explained in Leviticus chapter 25. Let me see if I can just pull it up on my screen here. Chapter 25, verses 35 through 37. It says, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God so that they may continue to live among them. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit." So notice there, it's not just a condemnation of lending money at an interest. It's also a condemnation of selling food. So you are not to lend money at interest. You're not to sell them food. So that's a very important point. And notice,
Like in on the supermarket.
I mean, I feel like that's a discussion to be had. That we'll probably get into that.
All right, continue. I was joking, but we could have that discussion. But that's the fun of this show. Sorry. So the quote's there for everyone to look at on the screen. So continue.
Thank you. Yeah, and you'll notice in both of these cases, there's an explicit reference to the poor among you. So it's not just a broader context of saying that you are not to lend money to your fellow Israelites, but it's a specific condemnation of lending money at interest to the poor among you, as well as selling food to the poor among you. Now, I'm not saying that that means that they could lend money at interest to their fellow Israelites, but I'm just pointing out that in context, that's what it's talking about. The text isn't actually saying more than that, even though many people have read into that more than that, which I think you can make a case for that, obviously in light of what the New Testament says about usury. But that is the biblical teaching, because then we learn about, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, we learn about the Jubilee year, right? So in the year of Jubilee, this is when all Israelite slaves would be to be released, and all debts were to be forgiven. So what's interesting about this is that if any and all lending of money was forbidden between the Israelites, it'd be very strange why there'd be a specific year dedicated to the forgiving of debt. So obviously, I'm not saying that this is debt at interest, but this implies that there is some kind of lending, most likely not at interest, going on between the Israelites. And so this is Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 2. Say, "Every 7th year you shall grant remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed." So it's saying that if you're a creditor among the Israelites and another Israelite owes you money, but it's the year of Jubilee, well, guess what? They no longer owe you money. And obviously the implication is that if it's not a year of Jubilee, well, then that person still owes you money and can pay it back. So this creates the distinction between what I would call a charity loan versus a loan that is eventually paid back. So in the book of Exodus, the condemnation on usury seems to be implying that the poor do not pay any of the money back. But then in Leviticus 25, we learn that there are some cases where if the person is in so much debt, they can actually be your hired servant. So this is actually gets into the topic of slavery in the Bible. One of the main sources of slavery among Israelites was debt slavery. And this was a legitimate form of slavery. And I mean, I know that might scandalize some people, the idea that the Bible speaks of legitimate forms of slavery, but it does. And one of those is debt slavery. And so all that to say that debt, it's not just as if you have to give a loan to somebody and then you just never expect them that they're going to pay any of it back. But there was a certain expectation on the Israelites that if they were to give a loan to another Israelite, they would eventually pay some of it back until the Jubilee year, in which case all the debt would be remitted. But what's interesting about Deuteronomy 15 is that that only applies to the Israelites, because God goes on to say, he says, when the Lord your God has blessed you, as he promised, you will lend to many nations, but will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. Now, this is importantly repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 28. And Deuteronomy 28 is talking about when the Israelites are obedient to God's covenant. So Deuteronomy chapter 28 begins saying, if you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you in a high place above all the nations of the earth. And it goes on in verse 12. The Lord will open for you his rich treasury, the heavens, to give the gift of rain to your land in its season and to bless all your undertakings. You will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. So in this case, we see that not only is usury being allowed, but usury is actually a reward for being obedient to God's covenant. And now we have to keep in mind, if usury was something, and I'm using usury and charging interest synonymously here because that's typically how it is, that's traditionally how it's been used. If usury is intrinsically immoral, like something like idolatry is, I don't think we can say God would give that as a reward to someone. I mean, could you imagine God saying, okay, if you're obedient to my covenant, I'm going to let you go into the Gentile lands and you get to worship their gods? You know, I mean, could you imagine God doing something like that? I personally couldn't. You know, you get to, because you have been obedient to my law, now you get to violate the law. That doesn't seem to be what's going on here. Instead, God seems to be speaking of a kind of usury that is actually blessed. And Seraphim Hamilton, that you mentioned before, that I kind of follow in his writings, has an excellent article about this called The Christian Concept of Capital, where he goes into detail about this is actually what happened in the history of Israel, is they would invest money in the nations, and then the nations were to pay back at interest to Israel, and then Israel itself was to pay that money back to God. This is why they tithed. It was a form of God loaning money or treasures to Israel. So we see this here. God says, I will open to thee my good treasure. And this is the rain, right? So the rain comes down from God because this is essentially God's loan to Israel. And then Israel is expected to use that rain to harvest and then pay God back through tithing. And so we see this interchange of God loans, so to speak, Israel money. They invest that money, and then they pay God back at interest, and then Israel itself will do this to the nations. And that is how Israel is going to gain dominion and rule over the nations, is because the nations are going to become indebted to Israel. And this is not only not a bad thing, this is not just a condescension to human weakness, this is a blessed thing. This is something that God says, if you are obedient to my covenant, this is what I'm going to let you do. Sorry, do you want
to? Now let me interject for a second. So this is when we have to have the mind of God and kind of have this large macro view of the scriptures, kind of see what's going on. When the Israelites left Egypt, they ransacked the Egyptians and they pillaged them.
Yeah.
And they took their silver and gold, and the fathers speak of, well, that's a reflection of taking what's good from pagan philosophy and leaving behind the idolatry and things to that effect. We see things where the Israelites are cursed so they don't utterly destroy their enemies, all their oxen, all their people, their women and their children, and dash their babies against rocks, which, just so people know, because this is like where people stumble, the fathers say dashing infants against rocks is a type for destroying wicked thoughts and passions. Mm-hmm. Right? And so just to keep that in mind. But so we see when Israel pretty much pillages the nations through usury, right? It's just the same thing playing out like we saw them do in Egypt.
Yeah. Right? I would oh, sorry, go ahead.
So that'd be my point. So like when we see something that would be otherwise objectively immoral, dashing infants against rocks, arbitrarily killing animals, because even a righteous man's kind to his animals. I think it's the 36th Psalm. Things like that in the scriptures, we have to keep in mind, well, why was God ordaining this? For what purpose? Other than just judgment. They were bad and they had it coming. Well, No, because also these things were to convey what the gospel was. Because what's Christ do? Right? Christ goes to the strong man's house and he pillages it, right? Christ takes those who were under the dominion of Satan and he turns them into children of God. And so we see here usury, in my mind, and please correct me if I'm wrong, being used as an example of an offensive weapon, just like if so much Israelites offensive weapons, but as a type of the gospel. The gospel goes out into the world, and in so doing, it now makes converts and brings in the wealth of the nations, which are its people.
Mm-hmm. I agree with part of what you said, and I disagree with other part of what you said.
Please disagree. Get into detail.
So this is actually a point that I've written about on my blog before about the pillaging of the nations. I think the point about Israel pillaging the nations, obviously the fathers are dead on when they say that the pillaging of the nations is an image of taking Greek philosophy. There's actually a lot more behind that about how the fact that usually the wicked are the first ones to pass cultural milestones, and then the righteous come in and inherit that. That's why Cain is the one who builds the first city, but then obviously it ends with the city of man, or the city of God being built in the book of Revelation. And that there's a lot that could be said about that, but I won't go into that. But all that to say that when Israel was pillaging the nations, God had given that to the nation, or had given that to Israel. And so it belonged to the Israelites. And this is why it's important to remember that we don't believe in a kind of divine command theory. It's not as if God could just command you to go commit idolatry, and then that would all of a sudden mean idolatry is okay. But rather, I think we do have to come up with these moral justifications for why God would command these things that appear immoral, but are really, there are certain exceptions for them. So I think murder is the perfect example of this, right? God commanded the Israelites to kill men, women, children, and animals. I've written on my blog extensively, I have an article called Is God a Child Murderer? Where basically I make the case that I don't think that this was a case of people who were innocent being slain, but if you read in every single time God gives the command to kill everything that breathes, it is focused on where the Rephaim giants are, who we learn are descendants of the Nephilim. And obviously God wiped out the entire world, which most likely included men, women, and children, because obviously Genesis 8 tells us that the heart of man is evil from his youth. And so that implies that there's children. Also the fact that the conquest of Canaan is actually a recapitulation of the flood. The same phrase is used, kill everything in whose nostrils is the breath of life. And there's lots of other parallels. But one of the striking parallels is that they're both focused around the Nephilim, Rephaim giants, who I would argue are the not physical descendants of fallen angels, but they are concrete manifestations of the demonic. Sarah from Hamilton has great articles on this. Basically, he argues that they are people who are ritually consecrated to the devil in every possible way, and that they are possessed with the full consent of the will. All that to say that the slaying of men, women, and children who are ritually consecrated to the devil is not actually immoral. And so that God, and it's like, obviously killing people is forbidden by, I'm so bad, I don't know the commandments, the numbering off the top of my head. It's forbidden by the Ten Commandments. However, there are cases where killing someone is not only not wrong, but it's actually necessary. Same with theft. There are cases, right? Theft generally is forbidden, but there are cases where it's not. If someone has something that belongs to you, as the Canaanites had land that belonged to the Israelites, then you can legitimately go in and steal that back from them. This is what Christ says in this parable about being the thief, right? He says that he binds the strong man and goes in and plunders his house. Well, what's the house? The house is the nations of the world. The nations belong to God. Satan has stolen them. So Christ is going to go in as a thief, and he's going to steal back that which belongs to him. This is playing.
Yeah, OJ did that. Remember, he got arrested for stealing back his own sports memorabilia, and he went to jail for it. So you're against that?
I'm just saying this is what I'm
okay,
saying.
So no comment on OJ. Continue.
I'm not going to comment on the OJ situation. I'm just saying that the principle here is that God does not command you to do something immoral, right? God is never going to create a situation where the options are disobey my law or disobey my law, right? That would obviously be contrary to God's mercy and justice. And so I would say that because God has blessed usury to a certain extent in the past, this means that there are certain kinds of usury that are not intrinsically immoral.
So what specific kind of usury would the nation of Israel do as a blessing, which would in effect bless also the other nations as a city on a hill?
I would say that this, and obviously I recommend once again reading Hamilton's article on this. He goes into a lot more detail about this, but basically Israel was to invest their money in the nations. They're supposed to lend money to the nations, as God said. And then those nations were going to foster their economies. They were going to foster their civilizations with that money, and then they would pay at interest back to Israel. And then we get an image of what this looks like in Jesus' parable of the talents, right? Where Jesus, actually, let me pull it up on my screen here so I'm not putting words in our Lord's mouth. He says, obviously, it's a story where Jesus, he lends out gold to 3 of his servants, and then 2 of the servants, they go and they invest that gold, and then they are able to return an interest payment back to their master. And he says, blessed are you, good and faithful servants. And then he appoints them in a place in his household. And then, but then the servant who returns to the master who squandered his money and did not repay at interest, he says, well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, you would have given it back with interest. And then he curses him to go out into the outer darkness. And so and this is an image not only of what our own spiritual lives are like, but this is an image ultimately of Israel, because, I don't really have the time to go into this now, but Jesus throughout the Gospels portrays himself as a one-man Israel. And so everything that Jesus is doing is, in a sense, Israel doing. So this is why Jesus' death and resurrection are being described as Israel's return from exile. And so this is what Israel was doing to the nations. This is also, many of the fathers commented on this by saying that this is also what the church does to the nations. This is what God does in our relationship, in his relationship to us. And so the basic principle here is that the master, the kind of usury being endorsed here, right? Because Jesus, as I mentioned, he's not describing himself as committing a sin, right? Jesus never sinned, and he doesn't use imagery. Like, Jesus would never give a parable of himself committing idolatry and saying, this is what the kingdom of God is like. And I already sort of covered the idea of Jesus being...
Oh, he kind of compares himself to the unjust judge. You keep nagging him, you give you what you want.
Well, I'm just saying.
But, all right, so that being said, so in the parable of the 10 talents, the issue would be, well, then you could have at least gave this money to the bankers, and they would have done something, they would have invested your money wisely, and you would have made some interest.
Yeah. And so the basic principle that's being established, then, I would say, because obviously, like I said, I believe that this is clearly an allusion to what Israel was doing to the nations, because, as I said, Jesus is portraying himself as a one-man Israel, and this is what Israel did to the nations. They lent to them, and they expected an interest payment to come back to them. And so the basic principle here is, notice that in the book of Deuteronomy, when God is saying that Israel is going to lend to the nations, it's always corporate bodies. So it's not it's not as if every individual Israelite is going to give to an individual Gentile and then gain, like every individual Israelite has command over every individual Gentile. But it's Israel as a corporate body is going to gain dominion over the nations as corporate bodies through the lending of money. And this is in order to foster economic and civilizational development. And I would say that this is the principle behind understanding, you mentioned at the beginning of this video, the idea of productive interest or productive usury, is the idea that usury is...
Let me interrupt you there, and I want you to get into that, but I want to interrupt you with this because what you just said essentially was when the nation of Israel, and I'm going to share a screen again. Come on, computers, right? It says, may the Lord open to thee his good treasure, the heaven, to give rain to thy land in season. May he bless all the works of thy hands, so that thou lend to many nations, but thou shalt not borrow. Thou shalt rule over many nations, but thou shalt not rule over thee.
Yeah.
Well, you're saying, well, that blesses the world. This exposes the world to Israel by them being indebted to Israel. And it appears they're lending at interest if they're indebted to Israel. But I'm going to tell you what this sounds scarily like, and it'd be hard to argue this is an example of God blessing the world through some secular means. Sounds like the world, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, right? They control the policy of these other countries. They indebt these nations. It's arguable some nations develop, but others just seem to become banana republics. It's neoliberal economics. They export bananas. They export whatever, a resource, but they don't actually ever create the diversified sort of economy they need to actually compete head to head with South Korea, the United States, Switzerland, more Japan, more developed economies. So it seems to me, if we were to look at this level of macroeconomics and go, oh, it's good for a nation, which is really what the World Bank International Monetary Fund is doing, a nation to lend to these other nations so they could be more productive. We're not seeing that play out in reality. Are you saying, do you think that's a good analog? Because I think we'll have viewers that'd be awfully suspicious that what you're saying is justifying what we see today is really an exercise in enforcing hegemony of certain Western states and really their central banks over third world countries.
That's a good point. I would say that your analogy is correct. However, I would not say. See, this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, I would say. Is because obviously God is saying that this is a blessing for being obedient to his covenant, right? Last I checked, I don't really think the International Monetary Fund is being obedient to the covenant of God. And so this, and so this is, and it's important that we don't divorce this. The reward for being obedient to the covenant is not divorced from the very act itself of being obedient to the covenant, but rather the one flows organically from the other. If you're obedient to God, God is going to economically bless you. And if you are economically blessed, then this will enable you to economically bless other nations. That's the principle being established here to Israel. And so it's contingent upon their obedience to the covenant. And so I would say that what you're describing about what things like the International Monetary, and obviously I'm not very well read on modern geopolitics and economics and all
well,
that.
Neither am I. I'm just making up as I go, but continue.
Yeah, but I would say that that what they're doing is not justified because it doesn't really seem like. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to judge.
So you're saying, you're saying ideally, let's pretend you got a Byzantine flag behind your back. Neo-Byzantine Empire is back. They're more Christian than ever, and they flex their financial muscle. They do lend money to other nations, but they're really building critical infrastructure. They're helping them invest in heavy industry.
Yeah.
And those nations, because of their close financial reliance upon the Byzantine Empire, cozy up to the Byzantine Empire. Heck, they convert their populations to Christianity, kind of like Russia and Bulgaria and Romania and Serbia, right? And so this actually becomes a means of bringing people to the gospel. Would you say that would be an example, though roughly, because Byzantine history is sometimes not so faithful, but would that be perhaps a positive application of maybe what we're seeing here?
I would definitely say so. And I was going to get into, when we get into talking about the fathers, actually, Emperor St. Justinian actually has a little bit to say about interest payments in what my name is, Codex Justinianus, it's the Latin for the Code of Justinian. And he actually wrote quite a bit about this in the Code of in his legal code. Yeah, I would say so, that if you have a nation that is faithful to the covenant of God, they actually have an obligation to assist these other nations and in some sense indebt them. I would say that we have emperor saints who have done a lot worse things to other nations to get them to convert to Christianity. And this actually also gets into
it would be nicer if they lent some money instead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, Emperor St. Constantine, he waged war against other pagans in order to help spread the gospel. Emperor St. Justinian did the same thing. I mean, Emperor St. Justinian, that's sort of what he's known for, right, is taking back the Western, the lands that had been lost to Western Rome.
Well, there were Arians, but also he made reforms that completely legalized paganism. Just like Theodosius the Great, the saint in the 4th century, the Edict of Thessalonica officially made Christianity the state religion. So we do canonize saints, particularly because they use the exercise of government force to bring people into the church.
Exactly, and I think that we shouldn't discount that, because I think actually that we should be looking to our emperor saints and our political saints for questions about politics, because obviously they are the ones they're saintly, and they also were intimately involved in these political discussions. And so I would say that what you described about a holy and righteous nation lending out money to underdeveloped nations in order to, in a sense, financially indebt them to one another in order to spread the gospel, I feel like that would be something that's acceptable.
So there it goes, Deuteronomy 28 in action.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a perfect example. But like you said, when we're applying this to something like the International Monetary Fund, when we're applying this to a secular organization that is trying to spread secular values, that's when it becomes a problem, I would say. So, yeah.
So, do you have any final comments on maybe the New Testament connections with usury in the Old Testament, or you want to start moving on to the patristics?
I feel like we can move on to the patristics, and maybe we could like the fathers always they touch on things that the Bible says.
So let me give a little overview then of the patristics. I could sum it up for you very succinctly, audience, and the scholars would agree. Usury equals bad, right? That's what all the that's what all the fathers teach, and they will affirm the scholarship in their review of the fathers that particularly what they're concerned about is the exploitation of the rich of the poor. All right. And so very much the concern of usury being evil has to do with its exploitive qualities and also that it's not productive, right? They will criticize, the fathers will criticize usurers for the fact that they aren't, those who borrow money for not saving and working harder and trusting in God to provide, and those who lend for not like having a more productive job, farm for a living, right? Like you kind of hear, like you see in the scriptures, work with your hands. It's a euphemism meaning be productive.
Yeah.
And so the fathers are, that's generally how they talk about it. But the sort of categorization we introduced at the beginning of this video was lending for money for useless crap is bad. It's bad for rich people, it's bad for poor people. And we're going to talk, it's mostly they're just concerned about the poor, but we'll also talk about the rich in a moment. But it's also bad, it's not bad if you're lending money for something productive. But this is going to require, in my opinion, and I want you to push back, inferring certain things from the fathers because they don't explicitly say that.
Yeah.
Right? So it makes it easy, right? If I lend money to your company and you pay me back, it's a corporate bond, that's productive. It's not like I lent you money to buy meth, like I said earlier. But lending money to someone who can't buy food, they need the credit card bill to pay their medical bills, right?
Yeah.
That would be like what the scriptures say, taking their shirt from them as pledge, right? That's what we don't want to do.
Yeah.
I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to hand it to you specifically to go over the fathers. And I've seen usury in real life, biblical error like usury, because I've been to a third world country. I've seen money changers in real life. Most like people watching this, most have never seen a real money changer. They think it's something that just existed back then. But you go to third world countries, there's money changers changing whatever local currency into euros, into dollars. It's pretty cool. It's like a gas station. It changes everywhere. And it's different down the block. But you could become obsessed. Oh, I could go here and get another 5 real compared to what I could get here. Or, oh, these people are country bumpkins, so I could rip them off and change them for less money. Or I could lend them at 30% interest. So what people don't realize is we think of banking, and we're going to talk about this, as these large institutions in New York City, right? And I'm Jewish, so I'm going to say it. People think almost always with Jews, there are a lot of Jews that are in banks, so it's just like Jews in Hollywood. It would be a lie to say that there aren't, but I can say that because I'm Jewish. You know, I think anyone could say that, but I just want to not be deplatformed for stating the obvious. But the usury of the scriptures is not what we think of the monolithic, evil, big banksters, right? To use a 1930s expression, the banksters. You know, that's the usury back then was individuals. So when you read the fathers, they're thinking of an individual who uses his own money to lend at interest as a job. It's like you right now taking money from your bank, lending to your friends, getting interest, and you're doing so good at it, but you're staying busy enough at it. That's your job. And so I've seen that firsthand. My wife had an aunt that was doing that. And just so you know, people that tend to do sinful things for a living don't generally tend to prosper doing them. So it doesn't last too long.
Yeah.
But this is the usury the fathers are talking about. So even if we're going to apply that to big banks today, that even's going to require for us to make some inferences, because what they were talking about was much more up close and personal.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to give that little real world example, because I've seen it still exists in the third world. But if you could, Ben, please give us an overview maybe of the fathers and some of the things you've read in the fathers about usury.
You know, I'll say that when I started looking into the fathers, this really got me thinking hard about money. Like, because I feel like we oftentimes we just pass over these statements about how you shouldn't be greedy. Like, yeah, I get it. I shouldn't be greedy. Yeah, I should give to the poor. But like, I feel like we don't really take, I mean, I can speak for myself anyways. I don't really take the time to meditate enough on just how much the fathers cared about this, just how much they cared about the poor. And I feel like in our modern world, we do tend to just look over those things. And so I want to be very sure that we're not doing that. Like, because I mean, once you hear the harsh words they use to describe usury, I mean, I'd say there's more homilies against usury than there are against sexual promiscuity in the fathers. Would you say that's a fair assessment? I feel like they almost talk more against things like usury than they do against even. And then think about how we talk. You know, we tend to talk more against, and obviously there's a reason for that, because obviously cultural stuff and all that. But anyways, getting into what some of the fathers say, I think it's important to understand. I mean, obviously, yes, the fathers say usury bad. That's a good way to phrase it. But we have to understand, why are the fathers saying usury is bad? And that's really going to, because like you said, our modern situation is so different from the world that the fathers were living in, that we have to make inferences from what they are saying in order to really get at it. And I think one of the best ways to do that is look at the reason why they're condemning usury, and then see if we can find that principle showing up anywhere in our modern society. And so I think St. John Chrysostom, I don't know the name of this. It was the one that you sent me, the article that you sent me earlier from St. John Chrysostom. I don't remember which homily that was. But he writes this. He writes, nothing is baser than the usury of this world, nothing more cruel. Why other persons' calamities are such a man's traffic? He makes himself gain of the distress of another, and wages for kindness, as though he were afraid to seem merciful, and under the cloak of kindness he digs the pitfall deeper, by the act of help galling a man's poverty, and in the act of stretching out the hand thrusting him down. So the point that St. John Chrysostom is making here is that the reason why usury is cruel, right? So he's not just saying that this is, oh, it's sinful. He's saying it's cruel, it's abusive. The reason he's saying this is because it's a sin against charity. You see someone who's poor and destitute, and instead of seeing an opportunity to give money, instead of seeing an opportunity to be generous, you see an opportunity to make money. You see someone who's poor, instead of thinking, oh, I can help this person out, you think, oh, I can make money. And that is what makes usury such a damnable sin in the fathers, is because it's such a sin against charity. It's just disgusting. And you're looking at someone who's poor and defenseless, and you're seeing that person as an object that can help you financially gain. And that is why the fathers speak so harshly against usury. St. Gregory of Nyssa repeats this point. He writes, "Usury's home is a threshing floor upon which the fortunes of the oppressed are winnowed, and where it considers everything as its own. It prays for afflictions and misfortunes in order to destroy such persons." So he's saying that usury is wrong, because if you're a user, you're hoping that somebody's going to be poor and destitute. You're praying for somebody else's misfortune so you can take advantage of it, right? That's the point that St. Gregory of Nyssa makes.
Yep.
St. Gregory the theologian makes a similar point. He says, the user is gathering where he has not sowed and reaping where he has not strawed, farming not the land, but the necessity of the needy. So you see this point repeated again and again in the fathers, that usury is a sin against charity. And you see someone who's poor and destitute, instead of giving them money, you instead try to make money off of them. I know I keep repeating that point, but I think it's so important, because how often do we see this in the world today? It's so prevalent in the world today, with not just obvious things like payday loans, but I'd even argue things like credit card debt. I mean, you look at the behavior of some of these credit card companies and how they target the poor. Like, they have algorithms to try and look at people who have certain finances, and they target credit card. They send them emails. It's disgusting, frankly. So
yeah,
I'd say
it's like, I'm a Jew. I've never paid interest on my credit card my whole life. I just use it so I could not carry change in my pocket. They can't make money off me. They need schmucks. You know, they need suckers. They need suckers that can't control their finances and they can manipulate.
that's exactly right.
And quite frankly, those suckers become slaves. They're working their whole life to pay debts. And what people don't get is, yeah, you get the TV now, but technically if you don't pay interest, you could buy a nicer TV later. That's where it becomes unproductive, right? Because you actually get less for your labor, because you're paying back, instead of doing something productive, to the banker. Yes. Or the microcredit.
Yeah, that's 100% correct, because that's another point that the fathers tend to make, as you mentioned before, is that not only is it unproductive, but it actually is counterproductive, because instead of using money to create new wealth and to better other people's lives, instead what you're doing is you're using money to consume resources, right? You're giving money to a poor person so that they can consume resources, and then you're just draining that person of their own money, and then you're just using it to line your own wallet. And so you're actually sucking money out of society by doing that. You're, instead of adding new wealth and adding new value, you are instead sucking it out of the society. And I mean, once again, how often do we see that? Where companies, they just prey, they're parasites essentially. I mean, I don't want to call anyone out in particular, but I will say something that's interesting is the Russian Orthodox Church released a statement called "Economy in the Context of Globalization," and this, I don't believe this was ever synodally confirmed. I read that this was just a draft, so I don't know if this is the official statement of the Russian Orthodox Church. But in this statement, I feel like I should read it if that's all right. They said, whole countries and nations are plunged into debt, and generations that are not yet born are doomed to pay the bills of their ancestors. Business expectations in lending, often ghostly, becomes more profitable than the production of tangible goods. In this regard, it must be remembered about the moral ambiguity of the situation. When money makes new money without the application of human labor, declaring the credit sphere to be the main engine of the economy, its predominance over the real economic sector comes into conflict with the moral principles revealed by God condemning usury. So once again, that's from the Russian Orthodox Church. So it seems like what they are saying is that because of our society is essentially run on credit, this inherently causes people to go into massive amounts of debt. And this seems to be a theme of the fathers as well. Once again, we have to make inferences from the fathers to our modern situation, that the fathers seem to speak a lot about how usury causes people to go into massive amounts of debt, and it causes them to become essentially, like you said, like the slaves of the people giving them money. And the Russian Orthodox Church is seeing this happen all over the place. We do see this happen all over the place. Think of the student debt crisis. Think of, the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, you could say maybe I'm not an economics person, so I don't want to say what caused the 2008 financial crisis, but it seems like usury was at the heart of it at the end of the day.
And we have to get into the modern day applications of central banking, fiat currency in this. But first, let's talk a little more about the fathers and that issue of productivity, because it could be extremely helpful to someone to get a real business off the ground, to teach someone how to fish instead of, let's say, just giving them a fish and then charge them interest for the fish. So I'm going to read some highlights from St. Gregory of Nyssa on his, and maybe I should, let me just make people dizzy. It's from his homily against those who practice usury, very aptly named. And he says this, he says, God, he slew the evil of money lending whose child is usury and has banished from his life money gained through, in quotations, trade. And he cites Ezekiel 22:12, where it says, and they have taken bribes to shed blood. You have taken interest and increase. You have greedily gained of your neighbors by oppression and have forgotten me. So what St. Gregory of Nyssa is talking about is not trade as in you're actually like trading mercantile goods for other goods, something productive. He's talking trade like this is not real trade, right? You're, instead of having a productive job, so that's why this dichotomy between unproductive is important, because you can't understand the sentence without understanding this is what St. Gregory of Nyssa was inferring, or implying rather, that, money lending whose child is usury, right? So it's one thing to lend at no interest. And as a Christian, right, God forgave you your sins. So someone really can't pay you back and they needed that money for their necessities. It's unproductive. They had to eat. Then forgive them the debt, right? Because God forgave you your sins. And so you actually experience the Christological reality of God forgiving your sins when you forgive someone else. That's why we pray, forgive us the trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We can't be forgiven unless we forgive.
Yeah.
Because we are partaking of Christological reality. St. Philaret of Moscow talks about that Christ's death on the cross is a fund of infinite merit. So you can look at that and go, all right, well, how aren't we all saved? And he says, well, no, this is applicable in as much as we conform ourselves to the death of Christ. And remember, that's death on the cross. So we must die into ourselves and follow after Christ. So the application to lending money is forgiving debts to people, right? That's what we see in the Old Testament. It's not a different God in the Old Testament than the New Testament.
Yeah.
Right? There's always God, plenteous in mercy and forgiveness, sins as far as from the east from the west. Well, then we have to start acquiring that sort of heart. And that means forgiving people debts for things that, they needed to eat.
Yeah.
And so we see money lending whose child is usury, right? It's like this perverted child from it has banished from his life money gained through trade, right? Because it's taken on unproductive means of making money. Now, elsewhere, and I got to cut this down a little bit, or we'd be just reading St. Gregory of Nyssa all night. St. Gregory of Nyssa a couple times condemns accumulation. Now, I remember in the translator's notes, he speaks of accumulation as in simply saving money, right? We see in the scriptures where the rich man builds silos to hold his wealth, and he says, rejoice, my soul, I have, money for many years. And then it says, like, don't you know this evening your soul will be required of you, right? So saving money, and this is something even on a personal spiritual level, I'm trying to discern. I'm not some spiritual expert, but even saving money could be excessive, the accumulation of wealth, because what should you be doing? Something productive with that money. St. Piso says, get your child educated and help them have a good life, right? So making sure your children are educated instead of just having a bunch of money in the bank. Make sure they go to a private school where they're not going to be brainwashed, right? Have them go to a good parochial school or whatever. So instead of just accumulating wealth, or give to those in need, give to those churches like those in Cambodia to spread the gospel, right? Instead of just accumulating wealth, lend it for productive needs. So it's a two-edged sword. It's not just lending so you could exploit someone. It's also not lending and just letting it sit there and not do anything productive.
Yes.
Now, and I think that's often forgotten. That's called accumulation by St. Gregory of Nyssa. It doesn't mean you can never save money, because St. Gregory of Nyssa actually permits for that. But accumulation would be excessively so, right? And this is what you have to work out with your spiritual father. Now, speaking of accumulation, St. Gregory of Nyssa says the following: you fail to assist him and free him from necessity while you indulge in personal wealth, right? So that's the sin of accumulation, right? You have all your money while this guy doesn't have, he's clinging onto the rock because he doesn't have anywhere to stay at night. The Job talks about, he says, that utterly destitute. Furthermore, you sow evils in this afflicted wretch, remove the clothes from his nakedness. So not only do you accumulate wealth, you lend to it interest and you make him more impoverished, right? So usury has that. It's not just accumulation of wealth, but it's trying to acquire the wealth of others instead of doing something productive. Let's continue St. Gregory of Nyssa. Money lending, he says, has no value and is rapacious, as in like rape. It is unfamiliar with such trades, right, legitimate trades, as agriculture and commerce. Like a beast, usury dwells in one place and delights in banquets. So this is actually what we're talking about before, literally St. Gregory of Nyssa talking about the difference between lending for productive means and unproductive means. So what's productive? Usury is unfamiliar with agricultural and commerce, right? Building up a business, building up a farm, buying a tractor so you can farm more, whatever. Like a beast, what's usury give money for? Dwells in one place and delights in banquets, right? So for people to enjoy themselves, right? So like today we'd be buying the flat screen TV, but back then it might have been, and this is very common in the third world. So I'm very happy I've been to Cambodia. Poor people waste money on weddings like you couldn't believe. Just freaking Google it. It's like they'll work years and get to all this debt because they'll treat the whole village to like this 3-day wedding. And that's like their whole life because, they're already poor. So, it's just like for a wedding or for a banquet. That means a lot to them for saving face. And so that's the sort of old world way of seeing things. So I give you that context because this is precisely what St. Gregory of Nyssa is talking about. It's not productive. And so you could blow it on a wedding.
Yeah.
I had a brother-in-law who literally wanted to borrow money. I'm trying to remember. he had to borrow money for something very important. I won't get to personal details, but he didn't want to use his own money because he wanted to use the money from a loan he had to pay for a wedding. Right? So I've seen this in real life. That's my point. So anyway, back to St. Gregory Nyssa. Money lending has, oh wait, I read that part. Rain and the passage of time yield money, while the scythe demands compensation. Usury's home is a threshing floor upon which the fortunes of the oppressed are winnowed. Right? So as we see, the scythe, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, like a sickle, actually doing something productive, right? You're farming. While the usury is just waiting for the money. You're not, instead of you actually going out and doing something, building something, growing something that's going to feed someone, all you're doing is waiting for the interest.
Yeah.
Right? It which is usury, St. Gregory Nyssa, is vexed by gold hidden in a person's home. Right? Meaning you could save money. That's gold hidden in a person's home. Why is it vexed? Why is it confused by people just saving money? Because it remains idle and unprofitable. Now he's using sarcasm. Usury imitates farmers who immediately plant crops. It takes and gives money without gain while transferring it from one hand to another. Right? So it imitates farmers. It's really not doing anything productive. It remains, they don't understand, the user, why you could just save money when you could just lend to someone. Don't save the money, just borrow the money. Don't save for college, don't save for the house, take the loan. And then you're working your whole house to pay, your whole life to pay for some house you don't need. Yeah. Right? To pay for a college education, which maybe if you really worked and paid for it, you realize being an anthropology major is a pretty stupid idea. You're not going to do anything with that. So these are some real applications. Now, before I continue a little more St. Gregory Nyssa, let me give you, Ben, some time to make some comments.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I kind of maybe to segue into discussion about like practical applications and stuff. You know, the fathers, they can, like you said, they consistently condemn usury because it is unproductive. It's not actually doing anything with your money. And like you said, you know, all users do is they lend out money, and instead of going out and contributing to society, all they're doing is they're waiting for the money to come back. Would you say that this could apply to companies that all they do is lend out people money and they don't actually do anything other than that?
Now, it's interesting because you were making reference earlier that simply changing the context doesn't make something objectively immoral, not immoral anymore. And so lending to poor people's exploitive, blah, blah, blah. So that's bad. But we don't tend to think of ourselves as poor because, to be honest, our diet within a week is more diverse than Louis XIV's in a decade, right? You know, so we live pretty high in the hog if we look at this historically. So we don't, but yet we don't view ourselves as poor. So is it okay that we have this debt, that debt, and the other thing? And I'm going to say the patristic answer is no. And we're talking about this before the show. I'm going to read a quotation from St. Basil. It's his second homily in Psalm 14. It's quoted, and guys, let me give you a reference. If you want to learn more about this, the seminal article on this work is Mahoney's The Teaching of the Fathers on Usury. So if you don't want to do the hard work of reading some of these full homilies, this is the work you want to read, which is Mahoney's Teaching of the Fathers on Usury. This quotation is there. And here's what St. Basil says. He says, "Are you rich? Do not borrow." So there's the answer to your question. Are you poor? Do not borrow. Okay, then we agree. He's the consensus, the fathers on that. If you are prospering, you have no need of a loan. If you have nothing, you will not repay the loan. Do not give your life over to regret. Let us, the poor, surpass the rich in one thing: freedom from care. So a lot of this is us getting a mindset which is disattached from worldly goods. The scriptures talk about friendliness with this world is enmity with God. St. John that's in James. St. John talks about not really being concerned about the world's goods. And so if you're already rich, what are you trying to do? Trying to borrow money? Well, I could get more rich. You're Trump. I'm the king of that. I want more houses. I want more golf courses. It's like, but you don't need that. you could be doing something better with your time and your money than becoming president and hated by the whole world. So there's that, you know. But if you're poor, it's like, no, you should be working and being content with what God has given you, because usury is not the way to prosperity. But that's why I think it's important that we look at, well, that doesn't mean wise business investments are bad, right? Because that would be the difference between, we were saying productive and unproductive, but like valid trades like commerce, like agriculture, like St. Gregory Nyssa was talking about, and simply just trying to debt poor people because they're bad, their money and need necessities, and they'll beg, borrow, steal from everyone they know so they can pay you back because they need to eat. So they're actually pretty good customers. They're dependable. Yeah. You know, they're dependable because they need help financially. So I think I have shown, and you have shown from the fathers, that this dichotomy between productive and unproductive usury exists, and that if it's unproductive, it's no good for the rich any more than it's no good for the poor. It just affects the rich differently. It makes them more a slave to their passions, while for the poor, it makes them more a physical slave to people.
Right.
Those things aside, you want to talk about practical applications. Do you have any more you'd want to make, or do you want to maybe get into some applications on a larger level, right? Modern institutions which have to do with usury or anything that effect?
Actually, I was thinking it might be more productive to talk about like maybe on like this more individual level, on the practical level.
Go right ahead.
So let's take the instance of student loans, right? So this is a big issue in our modern world. We have a lot of people who are taking out massive amounts of student debt or student loans, and they go into massive amounts of debt just so that they can go to college. What would you say that, like everything we've discussed from the scriptures so far and from the fathers, what would you say to that current crisis that's happening in our country?
Well, let me give a large general answer. This is, of course, the spiritual father, because we know from the last canon of Trullo, they could loosen canons or things. You know, let me share a screen real quick, actually, and because I think people forget this. I'm going to give a moral answer, but you have to remember, a moral answer doesn't get applied the way you always expect it. So we know the scriptures say, "Give to all those who ask," right? They also say, "Cut your eye out if it causes you to sin." There's those who become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. How literally do we take it or apply it, right? So we obviously know ripping out the eye is something spiritual. We don't look at things that cause us to sin. The eye is the window into the soul. You know, those becoming eunuchs are those who cut off their will, not their genitals, you know. So there are applications, but they may not be the applications that are as literal as some people may take them. But let me show you something from the Didache. It's from the first chapter. And so we know the scriptures say, "Give to all those who ask." But look what the Didache says. It says, "But also now concerning this, it has been said, let your alms sweat in your hands until you know to whom you should give." Right? So you never really think about that. Well, the scriptures say I should give all who should ask. So that means every homeless guy that comes up to me, I should just give him money. Well, what if he says buying drugs with it? You're really helping the guy by giving him money. And the answer would be no. The teaching of the fathers is, and most likely this is probably something Jesus Christ himself actually said. The Didache is really sayings from Christ. But be that as it may, it says, no, let your alms sweat in your hands until you know whom you shall give. So you say, well, how about student debt? Well, the macro answer to the question is, of course, it's wrong. There's nothing immediately productive. There's nothing quickly tangible you could apply it to where you go, yep, I'm doing something productive. It's going to provide for my family. It's building a business. It's labor that creates capital, right? Mm-hmm. You know, so from just on a very basic surface level, the answer would be no. On another macro level, we've seen the indebting of people has led to a generation of people that will do whatever the secular wing of politics will tell them to do and think. I have so much crushing student debt. Well, I guess I will vote Bernie Sanders and to bomb Syria and to kill all the babies because I got so much student debt. Let's be honest. That's really, people have very one-track minds, and it's usually money.
Yeah.
So we have captured a whole generation of people by enslaving them money and manipulating all their decisions and even their feelings, because that's how strong money is and the love of money. So I could say on even the macro level, you can see how wicked this is.
Oh, yeah.
You know, having to trap these people that and make them what's that word? Becoming, but like right, like even if you just got rid of that and made it an entitlement, you know, as long as you don't get into this or that trouble law, you got free college. Well, now you're just really dependent upon the government, and now you have to support all that. That's why people who get, let's say, food stamps who need them or this or that always tend to vote for the party that gives them those things.
Yeah.
Right? Or for the local politician who will give them those things. So really what you're doing is you're using money to enslave them. They're going to do what you want them to do. They'll wear the face mask. They'll get the vaccine. They'll do whatever they have to do because they need that money. And that's why we see in the book of Revelation, Mark the Beast is based on buying and selling, right? Money will motivate people to do pretty much just about anything, including forswear Christ. Now, I wanted to show the Didache there and to cite the last canon in Trullo, because could someone legitimately argue, not just lie to themselves, but legitimately argue that just like you borrow money to invest in a gold mine, to buy the equipment to go dig out the gold, ideally that's what your education should be, right? I'm investing in the education because I will get a job with a larger return on investment. Yeah. And technically that would be correct. Where the discernment lies is whether you're making the right decision. Do you have the right major to do that? Or are you going to college to discover yourself, to learn about the world, to become a well-rounded person, a better citizen? Or are you going to college because you're there to make money? The former sounds more high-minded, idealistic, but it's actually by usury standards immoral, while the latter would be justifiable by the standards of what's allowable lending of money and what's usury. And so I could say, I don't know what you major in. I'm presuming something history related, but
I'm a computer science major.
Oh, so you're going to make money. So you're doing the right thing. My wife majored in engineering, and she makes more money than I do. Not that I do too shabby, but the reason I make money is because I became an auto mechanic after I left college.
Yeah.
I don't need a college education to do what I do for a living. So that shows you I went and did something not college related, and that's how I make money. But all that aside, for my own son, I'm going to be gearing him towards, I hope, he's only 1.5 years old, but to become like a lineman for an electric company or something like that. Something productive, work with his hands. You need a brain to do it. If my son says, I want to be a musician, go do that in your spare time. Oh, I want to study this, study that. Like, unless you got it in here somewhere, you want to learn Greek or something, do it in your own time. Go to the Greek church. It's not something productive where there's a real future in it, especially with Google Translate stuff really good. I don't know, 20 years, how many translators will have jobs? It's going to be like Star Trek. They're going to have like instant translator. But so it was good that we took that aside, because we want to be like binaries. Borrowing money for college is right or it's wrong, right? And there's a lot of schmucks who hear the lie, go, people that are college educated are more likely to make more money over their lifetimes. But also that's like saying people that stay off drugs are more likely to make money more in their lifetimes. Or people that have not been in jail are more likely to make more money in their lifetimes than people have. It's a positive correlation, but it's not necessarily what's creating the positive correlation.
Yeah.
Right. Someone who graduates college usually is responsible and intelligent enough not to be addicted to drugs. That doesn't mean I don't know successful people who have done drugs. But generally speaking, it weeds out those people.
Yeah.
Just like, so if you were to say those who have started a business when they're 18 and paid more than $35,000 in taxes, so they actually have a real business, are more likely to make more money than well, yeah, obviously, because when they're 18, they had a work ethic and already built a business, right? So that's a bad argument. But could you go to college to learn a very specific skill, because that skill is a tool you need to make money? Yes, that would be justifiable. That would be the answer to the question.
Yeah, I would definitely concur with that. Although I'd also caveat that by maybe the fact that we even have to discern between these kinds of things, between usury and when it comes to colleges, and even when it comes to mortgages to buy houses, cars. Do you think that reveals something deeper in our society? The fact that we even have to consider going into massive amounts of debt in order to pay for these things, does that reveal something flawed in the way that our society is run?
Absolutely, and this is where people get into the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of Jews controlling nations. But despite their ethnic background, many are Jews, many are Indian. If we're talking about banking in New York City, whatever they are, it really doesn't matter. The truth of the matter is, we have a system that is backed by the government and treasuries, not just the Federal Reserve, which isn't treasuries, right? That's fiat money. They just print it out of thin air. But you got Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. You got government subsidized banks whose purpose is to say, oh, we'll lend money to people who will pay with interest. It's like government subsidized loans for college, by the way, to get houses. Well, what's that do? It increased the price of houses. So anyone who's been in the market for a home the last year, including my wife and I, would have noticed that even though with COVID, a lot of people lost jobs, the prices of houses skyrocketed. And there's two reasons for that. Artificially low interest rates, and which made it easier for people to borrow more money, right? It's, for example, the interest rate's low, you get a bigger loan, but have the same monthly payment. That's what people think about their monthly payment. They're not thinking about how much long-term interest they're paying. So there's that, but also there was a moratorium on paying back debts, which is about to be lifted, which I'm sure President Biden and the Democratic Party will extend. I don't know how long you could humanly do these sort of things, but that's besides the point. So, all right, people never have to pay back their loans, and it's easier to get a loan. More people are going to get loans. More people are going to get houses. But eventually you have to pay back the piper. More people are in debt. They'll work their whole lives to pay back these houses. Now, if you didn't have government-subsidized banks, you didn't have interest rates that were made in which to encourage people to buy homes that they couldn't afford with certain monthly payments, they'd be buying more humble homes, right? Instead of getting the now the average kitchen renovation is like $40,000. They'd just work with whatever they got in the kitchen. They wouldn't put a $40,000 kitchen there because no one's going to loan them the money for it. So what has happened is we as society have accepted we should get into debt, and that means have a house beyond what I really need. Have cars that, like, it has a heated and cooled seat and it can connect to my iPod. Last time I checked, you just need to get to point A to point B. It doesn't matter how entertained you are as you're doing it and how warm your butt is, right? And let's be honest. Oh, that house looks old. That paint in my house looks old. This car looks old and ugly. It's not fast enough that you can't drive past the speed limit. So the culture of debt has inflamed the passions. I mean, that's what Satan's obviously doing through wicked people. Yeah. It's encouraging people to become slaves of this world. Now, I will quote a great quote from Papa Roach, the rock band. It said, "The things that you own now own you." And that's what debt does. You get you addicted to stupid crap, and now that crap owns you. And that's the point, because if you are owned, you're a dependable citizen, per se. You're a dependable debt slave, right? Yeah. And this has existed throughout history, whether it was on the hacienda, right, with the tenant farmers and the hacendado, whether it's sharecroppers. You don't need literal African slavery to turn people into slaves. There was a thing during the Civil War where they say, turn free men into slaves and turn slaves into free men. And well, that's actually only a half truth. They took free men and turned them into slaves, because that's when we started doing the greenbacks and all these different kinds of things with the government. And then we just turned slaves into different kinds of slaves. They turned them to wage slaves. So it's something that people don't realize, where if we look at Israel, people have ancestral lands. Like in my wife's country, they just have ancestral land. They don't need to do anything to get it. It's just your ancestral land. Whatever money you make, you put whatever in your land. They're poor. They don't have fancy stuff, but they have their land and they have their food and they get by. It's a more humble way of living. Now, this doesn't mean, and maybe, let me ask you, what I just said to me seems like, well, how do we have progress? How do we lend to do audacious things? Why can't, well, without usury, could we become the Jetsons? I mean, what's your theory on that?
It is something that I would have to think a little bit harder about. But to give a general answer, I would say I mean, it is possible to make civilizational progress without engaging the massive amounts of usury that our current society does. Actually, interestingly, a recent article was put out on ancient faith condemning usury, which is, I don't know, it's kind of interesting, because you don't really expect an article like that to show up on ancient faith, but it did by a priest named Father Cassian Selby, which I highly like. It came out just like a couple of weeks ago. Highly recommend reading it, where he points out that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I could be making this up, but I thought I remember hearing that he was good friends with either a saint or a recent elder who approved of some of his writings. I might be making that up, but I thought I remember hearing that. But anyways, Alexander Solzhenitsyn obviously wrote a lot against communism because he wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He wrote all these tracts against communism, but he also wrote a lot against capitalism as well. And I feel like a lot of Christians, maybe not so much Orthodox Christians in the old country, but maybe here, sort of view capitalism as synonymous with conservative values, with Christian values. But when you read the fathers, when you read the scriptures, that's not really the case. And obviously, because capitalism, what it's premised on, like you said, on constant growth at any cost. It's premised on usury. I mean, not like intrinsically in economic theory, but that's where it ends up. Like that's why we've been discussing, our society is entrenched in usury.
And for what it's worth, it's theoretically flawed. You can't increasingly grow with finite resources.
Yeah,
I mean, technically speaking, it's just not possible.
That's a great point. Yeah, capitalism by its very nature seems to contradict the principles of Christian economics. However, and it's because of this principle of constant growth at any cost. Individualism, right? This idea of radical individualism is heavily tied to capitalism. And all of these horrible things, like even our modern consumerist society, all of the advertisements companies, big tech, all these conspiracy theories, which I'm not calling a conspiracy theory to say that it's necessarily wrong, but you know what I'm referring to about big tech taking over.
Because there's real theories and there's real conspiracies. Continue.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not as if, you've seen some like libertarians or people like online saying like, well, companies like Twitter, they have a right to ban whoever they want from their platform, and they have the right to do this as private companies. It's like, well, at a certain point, they just become so large that if you control Twitter, you control the town square, you control free speech, and you can make a legitimate case that it's infringing on people's rights, and it's not as if the government is like engaging in corporatism. I'd say it's actually the other way around. The companies have become more powerful than the state, and that, they can censor the president of the United States. That's how powerful these companies are. It's ridiculous. And so I would say that, and I know that I'm kind of getting off topic of what you initially asked, but I would say that this idea of constant growth that is so ingrained in our society is not a Christian ideal. That said, I think there is an aspect in which God wants us to grow, right? St. Vincent of Rennes talks about the development of doctrine, the growing of the church into maturity, right? Obviously, there's a major theme in the Old Testament and in the entire scripture, the idea that God's people, we start in infancy and then we grow into maturity, right? The church is likened to a human being, has a body, has a head, and so the church grows up in a certain sense through our meditation on the doctrines and everything like that. And obviously, what starts as a garden in Eden eventually grows up into a city in the city of God in the book of Revelation. And I would consider myself a post-millennialist in that I believe that the church will have a triumphant victory in the history before the second coming. And so I think that there will be a progress of civilization, but it's not going to happen through engaging in sinful activities like usury. It's not going to happen through engaging in taking and preying upon poor people, upon submerging people in debt. It's going to happen through being faithful to God's covenant. Like I said, this goes back to what we said about the book of Deuteronomy. God rewarded the Israelites with the idea to invest generously and then get money back. He rewarded them that for being faithful to the covenant. So the only time that this kind of investment, because like I said, we've talked about how there are legitimate forms of investment and charging an interest, and this investment happens only if you are obedient to the covenant. That's when it leads to legitimate civilizational growth. However, I will also put a little thing to meditate on. We talked earlier about how God how I mentioned earlier about how usually the wicked are the first to pass civilizational milestones, and then the righteous come and inherit that. So we see that where Cain is the one who builds the first city, right? The sons of Cain are the ones who develop musical instruments, they develop technology, but then this is inherited by David in the Levitical choir. He uses the instruments that were created by the sons of Cain. And then obviously the city of man is replaced by the city of God. And the Israelites do this as well. They plunge the cities. And this also happened with philosophy, right? The Greeks, they developed philosophy in a sort of obscure pagan way, and then the church inherits that and glorifies it. And so I would say that our modern society is progressing in a wicked way, and then the church is going to come in and inherit all the progress that the modern society has made, and then is going to take that and eliminate all the immoral aspects of it and glorify it. And I think that that is how God is going to use the current timeline of history in order to bring progress in society. And so he's going to allow these evil things to happen, and then he's going to give it to us as the church. So our job is not to engage in these evil practices. It's not to encourage them, but it's sort of just to wait until God grants us the time. It's to pray. It's to be obedient to the covenant and trust that God is going to do the things that he's promised to us.
And for that reason, because we should trust, local parishes shouldn't be borrowing money from the bank to build a bigger building. I've seen beautiful Orthodox churches where they're so packed of people, the people are sitting to the outside. It's a beautiful sight. And save the money until you could get it, and build it. Like what St. Dionysius the Areopagite monastery is doing in Long Island. So I hope you guys send money to it and help support them. But I think the promise lies when people realize that there's no panacea, there's no economic silver bullet, right? It's like what we're talking about usury, what the fathers say in the scriptures. It's not about taking advantage of people. No one's going to get richer doing that in the long run, the macro level. Rather, it's about lending and helping, lending and forgiving. And when you're not forgiving, towards something productive, right? We don't lend and expect back that guy needs it to live. That just makes you a scumbag. We want to, if we want to lend to make money, it ought to be something productive. When COVID was the lockdowns in the beginning, I had an article which I linked to in the chat section, Ramblings on Economics. And I said the following, we need a new economic paradigm, because people think you can just print money and borrow money and that'll jumpstart the economy. Or if it's communism, we'll just give everyone jobs and redistribute all the wealth, and that'll get people to be productive. But really, the real question is, at the very core, is how do we motivate people to work more and more efficiently? How do we maximize productive labor? That is the answer to all economic problems. And it's the one we all ignore. We all want magical solutions, but it's actually very simple. Capital is labor, right? So how do you help someone else and provide for them? And how do you help yourself and others be more productive and more efficient? Because productivity, efficiency, they're the same thing, right? Yeah. That's the answer to every economic question. And it's not coincidentally, that's really what lies behind the issue of usury. Because whether it's marriage, whether it's families, whether it's citizens in government, whether it's workplaces, all these things reflect Christological realities. Christ says, I am always working, as the Father is always working, right? And so it's working and accomplishing something, being productive. We actually experience the grace of God. That's why even when you don't even get paid for it, right? The slaves that just work, it says in Colossians chapter 3 that you'll be rewarded, right? When you serve the master as if he's God. Because work itself is partaking in a Christological reality. So you could use that to motivate you to either be a more dutiful employee, which shows Christ in the workplace, to do productive things, take your own private time like we're doing now to do a good old webcast, hopefully raise some money for the churches in Cambodia, to do community service in your neighborhood, to do good work for your company, build the best software, do things they weren't doing before, take them to the next level, doing something productive. Yeah. Because productivity is what helps people, and mercy is what saves people. So we want to be merciful and we want to be productive. So those would be my final words on this subject. And so we'll look at some comments and questions and call it a night. So let's see. We got some anti-Jewish comments.
Yeah, you're always gonna get those.
Yep, and just gotta laugh at it. We have this. Would you say that money printing is a form of usury because it encourages consumption and penalizes saving? The answer would be yes, on several levels. One, when you inflate the monetary supply and you now have negative interest rates, where it actually the idea is you keep money in the bank and don't actually spend it, it loses value. So it's like, man, I better buy that jet ski now before I can only buy a loaf of bread with that money. Then yeah, it's precisely that. But also we see, for example, it's not the main way the U.S. Treasury gets their money, but the second largest source of revenue for the U.S. Treasury is not income taxes; it's debt on the it's Federal Reserve interest that the banks pay back to the central bank. So like Alex Jones conspiracy theorists just think that like the banks get all that interest on the money they just print out of thin air Federal Reserve and stick in their pocket, which is actually not true. It goes back to the Treasury. It's about like $1 trillion a year. So it's a ton of money, but it's not like the Rothschilds are getting all the money in their pockets. I don't know how they get their money, but that's a different story. So the point, though, is we could see we have a system that instead of taxing people, actually indebts them and then inflates their monetary supply so that they can tax them without their consent. Because no one votes for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates or to quantitatively. There's no vote for that. Yeah. Last Friday, we had a show, The End of the World, and I said, well, part of this is going to be the fact that the central banks are going to directly send you money on a debit card, which will increase the velocity of money, increases inflation. So yes, it's tied into usury because the whole point's consumption. It's about inflaming the passions. When we know actually it's capital, I don't want to get wrong economic term, but it's amassing capital that leads to investment in productiveness, right? In order to, like, for me to become let's say for you to be in computer science, let's say there's no loans, you got to save money to go to college, right?
Yeah.
So you spending the money is going to help you be more productive to you saving it. Like for my wife and I, us saving the money to buy a house, right? That helped us buy something instead of taking a loan and paying it back a little with interest. And now my family has less money because the bank's getting a good portion of that money in a 15-year loan. You'll be paying more in interest than be paying on principal. Right? Well, now I don't have to do that. That money stays in my family because we worked and we saved. Right? Yeah. So capital accumulation actually helps you invest towards things that are more productive in the long run. That's a fact. So when you have an economic system that encourages the opposite, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get people being less productive. And then they're going to say, oh, they're less productive and we're having economic problems. Because remember, capital is labor. We're having economic problems. They're less productive. How do we fix it? We're going to have to pump prime the economy. And we got to obviously it's not going to work. So that's the issues we're running towards. And that's why people, if they want to worship Donald Trump or whatever, he was part of the problem, not the solution. Doesn't mean he's bad about everything or good about everything. But this is a problem for a day. And it comes with accepting the fact that banks are this institution above the government. They're not voted on. They control your money. They control everything. So good question there. Let's see if we got another question. Someone has said, define usury. We said this a couple times, but just for the sake of recapitulating what you said, could you do that first, Ben?
Yeah. So I would say, actually, let me go over sort of what we discussed about this. So the Bible speaks of usury only in the context of lending money to the poor. I'm not saying that that's all usury is, but that's the context of the Old Testament is speaking about usury. And then, so we know that when you prey upon the poor, when you are lending money at an interest instead of giving money to somebody. So that's the primary concern of the fathers, is that usury is when you lend money to somebody who needs it instead of charitably giving them money, right? And then but the fathers, they also condemn this for the rich as well. And so we know that it's when you are also taking money out, you're going into needless amounts of debt in order to fund your own lavish lifestyles, in order to consume things that you don't need, right? As St. Basil says. So usury is primarily, it is lending money either to destroy the poor or to fund your own lavish lifestyles. And both these things are unproductive. They're things they do not contribute anything to society. They're either ruining somebody or they're just making you indulge your own passions more. And so that's why we say that usury is when you are lending money at an interest for unproductive purposes. Now, the kind of usury that would be permitted then, I think maybe a good example would be like if you have money and you know somebody who is going to start a company, but they need startup money to get that company started, and they say like, hey, if you give me $1,000 now, I'm going to get this company started, and then I will pay you back $1,000, and I'll also give you another $1,000 because as like sort of like a thank you or to pay you back. And obviously that's not the same as like interest, but it's paying back more than was initially given to you. That would be, I would say that's okay, because in that case you are first of all, you are putting risk, right? That's an important part, that you are risking something and you are contributing to the production of new wealth. You're not destroying anybody. You're not trying to fund your lavish lifestyle. Instead, everybody wins, right? The person gets their business, people get more product of whatever it is that person needs, and you get $1,000. Nobody's getting ripped off. Nobody's being abusive or cruel to anybody else, and nobody's indulging the passions. And so I guess that would sort of answer the question a little bit.
It shows you that's what the Amish have right in a way, and monastics for that matter. They work for work's sake. Right? Because that keeps you occupied, not thinking about bad things. It takes energy away from indulging in passions and whatnot. But also, I live in central New York, and we have Amish. They're always provided for. They're prospering. They're growing with families, and there's people with 1-2 kids, and like, how do we get by? Like, the Amish are getting by, So it's work. God will reward work. Doesn't mean if you envy others. I don't have what they have, but God will provide for you if you work and you're productive. And again, I say that because it's a consistent string that connects to all these things about productivity.
Yeah.
We have someone says usury is more than just charging interest. And he adds, what do you do with negative interest rates? And that's a good question. The idea of negative interest rates is to force banks to lend money. So it actually has to do with charging interest. By charging for a central bank to charge its member banks money to even have money, they're going to get rid of their money by lending it to people at interest. So it's actually to put usury on steroids. That's the point. Right? It's not a system of banks giving you free money. It's a system of compelling banks to force people into usury. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
To force people into debt slavery. So it's kind of scary that, that's the newest thing in economics. May God have mercy.
Yeah.
And very eloquently put, negative interest rates are usurious because they encourage spending money on useless crap. Come on, not meth. All right. It's the third time I mentioned that. So anyway,
I think someone just asked a question now.
I'm not Mr. Tech Savvy, so I'm slowly working my way down. My apologies. Maximus says, some private student loans interest can basically send people into debt slavery if they default. Yeah, like it's interesting. Unless you become like a special ed teacher or like a doctor, there's certain ones like weird exceptions where, you could, if you do it for X amount of years, you don't have to pay the debt anymore. It's like you can't, even if you declare bankruptcy, not the student debt, you still got to pay that back. It's crazy. It's made to enslave you. And it's interesting. It's made to enslave the best and the brightest, because before, the best and the brightest, you couldn't control them. They were self-sufficient back then. They were farmers. They had land, or they worked in factories. Now that the economy is changing, how do we control these people? We get them into student debt. So it's all a way of controlling people. Yeah. Now, someone made the comment, didn't Byzantium ban usury for pretty much the entire empire? I was under the opposite impression that it was never illegalized. And I think I explicitly read that. I forget which article. Could you confirm or deny?
I can't speak for the entirety of Byzantine history, but I can just say that in the Code of Justinian, I believe that this is Book 3, Title 26 of the Code of Justinian, which you can get on Gutenberg.org. Saint Justinian And it's important to figure out like what Saint Justinian was doing here. He was not creating all these new laws. He was taking laws that had previously been in place in the empire, and he was sort of codifying them in sort of a more Christian context, if that sort of makes sense. That's a very simplified version of what he's doing here. But Saint Justinian basically, he doesn't directly talk about usury. The word doesn't really come up, although the word interest does. So I guess I'm not really sure with whether or not those are being used as synonymous. But anyways, he makes a distinction between two kinds of loans. So there is a loan for consumption, which is, he says that an example of this would be like if you give someone your ship just to borrow it, right? That person is under a legal obligation to return that ship to you, but that's it, right? It's a gratuitous loan. They don't have to give you $100 in addition to the ship. He said that's a loan for consumption, but then there's also a loan for money, and that's a case where you can charge interest. And this Saint Justinian, like I said in Book 3, Title 26, just speaks of this as if it's a normal thing, and he just gives examples of this happening and gives some guidelines for how you should deal with this. He never exactly says whether or not. Well, obviously, it's being allowed because it's not being condemned. So it's allowed in Saint Justinian's reign, insofar as it was not condemned. But I don't really know if that is the same as an endorsement, if that makes sense.
I mean, usury is very bad. Like in Catechetical Lecture, in the fourth one by Saint Cyril of Jerusalem. In the 37th paragraph, he makes mention of like this list of terrible sins, witchcraft, this and that, and he includes usury with it. So it's essentially a mortal sin. But the church otherwise has been pretty lenient with usurers, provided their repentance. I think unlike, let's say, certain sexual sins, like adultery, divorcing your wife, like usury is like a career decision. Right? How many careers you're young, but a lot of people, like, if they're old enough, you left the career, you never go, it's like you relapse back into the career. Like, you could kind of make a clean break, while it's different. It's usually different other kinds of immorality. So generally the church has been lenient canonically with, like, penances with usury. Like, as long as you give the money to the poor and then don't do it ever again, all right, now you can become a bishop. That sort of deal. So they've been generally lenient with penances, but that doesn't mean not repentant from that. It wasn't of a serious nature; is considered absolutely damnable.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So I was just going to say, I think it's also worth mentioning that I think the kind that maybe even we could say that the kind of interest loaning that Saint Justinian is allowing here isn't necessarily usurious, because it seems to be in the context of business deals. So it seems to be in the context of, like you said, things like corporate bonds, although obviously those things didn't exist back then, but it seems analogous to that. So it might not even be talking about what we're considering usury here, but I'd have to read a little bit more into that.
Good point. The Maximus takes issue with, I said, schmucky guys make a killing being electricians, right? Which meaning average dudes. I'm not actually calling electricians schmucks. And by these says, no, they don't all make money. I know electricians that barely get by. It depends where you live. 2 points. Well, yeah, it's like being a farmer in the Sahara Desert. You're not going to do so well. So yeah, if you're like an electrician in a place with collapsing demographics, Central New York, parts of Central New York, Detroit, places like that, it might not be so good. But also, a lot of electricians aren't good businessmen. You ever notice you need an electrician, and it's always like, oh, I'll get back to you in 3 weeks. That means you're pretty busy, And what do they get paid an hour? Like more than $100. You get $200 to walk in the door. So there's something you're doing wrong if you're not making a killing doing that for a living. But again, a lot of it has to do with people not being good businessmen, having very bad help. But it's something where if you're smart, you don't need to be college educated smart, but you can be smart and make very good money being an electrician. So let's see. We got some very egalitarian things about gender issues in our comment section.
Very nice.
Let's see. Oh, this is kind. Thank God for people like Seraphim Hamilton. I say thank God for Ben. Seraphim Hamilton's a little too fancy for me. Ben puts it where a guy like me could be like, oh, I get it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
But that's why you guys have to check out ancientinsights.wordpress.com. There's not like, if you look at my video section for like how many people I subscribe to with this channel, it's not a lot. It's like, like 5 channels. There's not a lot of people I really follow with Orthodox apologetics. I think most of them pretty much suck, but not Ben. I think he's doing really good stuff. So check out ancientinsights.wordpress.com.
Thank you.
He's only guy now that I'll reblog. Allura from Shameless Orthodoxy has done some good stuff. We have our disagreements about universalism, obviously. But I've also reblogged him. Otherwise, not a lot of people I'll reblog. But I think you're doing good work. But I know darn well Seraphim Hamilton is your inspiration, and so that means he must be doing something right if you're doing good stuff.
He is, yes.
All right. Now someone said, what if you're saving to build an Orthodox parish? I would actually, I say, not the Lord, that the church should not go into debt. In Cambodia, right? The Moscow Patriarchate has 3 parishes. They start by renting a place in Siem Reap, $300 a month. You donate $300 tonight. Guess what? You're the reason why there's worship in Siem Reap for 1 month. And one of the world's largest cities. And so that being said, $300, you don't need to get into debt to do that. But I'll cry for money a little bit later. Not for me, but I was just told some bad news about what's going on in Cambodia. So I'll give an update when we close. But yeah, you're not being difficult. We should trust God. Doesn't mean I always do this. I'm a sinful man. But if we are obedient to God, God will bless us, right? So we have to trust that he will grow the church if we're obedient to him, right? Like, you don't need a good investment guy. You have the guy that controls everything. And you're his body. He'll nourish you. Don't worry. Just be cooperative with him.
Read the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, that's right. Like, don't worry about being open-handed because God will bless you. I told something wise. When my wife and I were getting married, in this premarital counseling, we're told, don't worry about being open-handed. I've never seen someone who's generous ever be destitute. And Jesus Sirach says the same thing. So it's in the Deuterocanon as well. But it's true. When you see a generous person, it just doesn't exist. Right? You're like, oh man, he was so generous. He freaking went bankrupt and died of starvation. You never hear that story. It never happened in like human history.
Yeah.
There's saints that gave away their whole wealth, and even in those, they're like Job. Like, you find out like their daughter then marries like a Byzantine prince. And then he takes all the money he gets from that and gives it away. Because he's a saint. So you don't have to worry about being generous.
Got to worry about the other thing.
Maximus makes a point, which is papist schools are worse than public schools. I don't know. Public schools are pretty darn bad. I guess it depends on the school. I was told by an Orthodox priest it's preferable to homeschool than an Orthodox school if it exists, then a Roman Catholic school or a Protestant school, and then the secular schools. I think the issue is, I'm going to speak secular. This has nothing to do with even like religion. You're not taught regular science anymore. You're not even taught somewhat unbiased history. Like, our history is always patriotic, right? You always spent like 1,000 years in Revolutionary War and the Civil War. But like my master's thesis was in textbook studies. And it was about how the textbooks were made to inculcate American values. It's brainwashing. That's why they teach you history. But like, it's very much become identity politics now. So it's like, you're not even getting like a sense of being American from the history classroom. Math is not even normal math anymore. It's not about getting the right answer. It's about following all these wacko steps. So I guess my concern with education is not even properly educating people anymore, right? Like, you can't go to science class and learn real science because the science is offensive. XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes have become political somehow. What a vaccine does, what a vaccine doesn't do has become political somehow. So that's more my concern even, is like, you can't even get a decent, like, secular education in a secular school, let alone anything to do with religion. But I appreciate that insight. Let's see. GM foods suck. GMO foods. I don't know what that's in reference to, but I would agree. I always tell my friends, I'm like, I'm not hoity-toity. My wife and I own one car. It's a used car. We live very frugally, in all honesty. We make decent money, but we live very frugally. But our like luxury is organic food. right? But it's sad I call it a luxury because we buy food that's not poison. Right? It's not poison food. It's me somehow treating myself. I'm trying to be healthy. So what can I tell you? The GMO foods it's interesting. 30 years ago, it would have just been food, would have been your organic food. Now you got to spend extra money to get normal food. Buy organic fruit. It's expensive, and you realize, wait, it actually tastes like something. You know, so, and you realize, well, that's because that's how fruit's supposed to taste. It's interesting. Let's see. Da-da-da-da. All right, we might be done with questions other than this cool comment, other than haha. There's a Zionist element, but also an Anglo-British royal family element, and German ideals element. They're like mafias that fight each other on a global level. In short, Satan's behind all these things. And so, especially as being of a certain ethnic group is less important, there's less ethno-nation states, really, right? Everything is becoming very international. Being Jewish is not going to, it's not really going to mean anything. You don't need to be Jewish to be a usurer anymore, unlike, medieval European history, which is how they got started in it. It's not like being Jewish enables you to be a usurer. It's not like being in England is going to help you be in the Bank of England. All this is not mattering as much. That's why Japan, China, especially China, is getting a foot at the table. Just look at COVID. Everyone's following China's lead. Yeah. So it shows you it's just Satan works with whatever ingredients are there, whether it's ethnicities, nation states, whatever. But in the same way, God works with what's there because God calls us wherever we are, wherever he may find us. And so I think, it's something where if you know something about finances, it's something you could use for good, right? But you have to be guided by the principle of grace and mercy and forgiveness and debts and productivity, right? So that'd be those comments. And we got no more cool questions.
Actually, I see one question at the bottom here about mortgages for homes that I think might be worth answering.
What's your answer?
Well, interestingly, I've mentioned in private discussion that Metropolitan Hirothios Vlachos wrote an article about usury and capitalism, and he said that there might be some circumstances under which things like getting mortgages on a home can be justifiable as long as it's not overindulgent. And so I think we mentioned earlier about how student loans, how you could maybe, if you're going into a productive field, and it's like the only way that you will be able to, like, let's say you have like no skills whatsoever, but you're really good at being an engineer or something. And so it's the only way that you'll be able to support your family in the future. So you decide to take a loan and then you go to school, and that you'll be productive and that you'll use that productive money to pay off the loan and to contribute to society and all of that. I feel like maybe you can make a similar argument about housing, right? Because I feel like you could say something along the lines of like, well, I have a big family, or like I'm planning on having a family, and we can't be prosperous unless we have a house, but we can't buy a house unless we take on some kind of debt. But I don't know. I feel like that's an issue that you'd have to discern with your spiritual father, asking about those kinds of things. So that'd be kind of my reason on that.
Yeah, I would answer that sort of similar to the college education question. That it would be usury, but the question would be: is that applied categorically, right? What if you're buying land that comes with a house and you could farm off it, right? Like, there's something productive you could do, or you could run a business out of it. What if in that area, renting is just as much money as the house after? Just people are stupid. You got to buy homeowners insurance. You got water bill with the house. Things break in the house. The landlord don't fix it. So it's not always as cheap as people think. But let's say it is cheaper. Then yeah, you get into debt. There's actually less money and more productive for you, right? Than you not in just renting, depending on the area. And God's gracious. He knows our ignorance. You made the wrong decision. You thought it was less money and it wasn't. At least you weren't trying to do the wrong thing. So I think like Metropolitan Hirothios, however you say his name, makes the point, right? If it's not crazy and ostentatious, it should meet that bar of being productive or being cheaper in some way. It could easily do that in most situations. If it doesn't, it's probably highly suspect unless you feel it's the only way to save your money against inflationary measures. So, like, for example, let's just pretend you knew for a fact hyperinflation is going to happen in 5 years. You need a wheelbarrow of money to buy a loaf of bread. Well, you're sure going to hope you bought that house for like that wheelbarrow of money instead of the loaf of bread, right? So it's again, it's the intent, right? Almost all stuff, it depends on your intent, right? Even like we were talking about privately, even concubinage was permitted in the church depending upon the intent of the concubine to take care of the children, that she was loyal to the man and stuff like that. It doesn't make concubinage good, but it shows the church could permit certain things because it's actually the best decision given the circumstances.
Same with slavery as well.
And same with slavery and all sorts of things. So a mortgage might be the best of bad decisions, and then you're obligated to take it. We read about this. Like there's a saint who didn't fast on a Friday because the Turkish Pasha, I forgot how you pronounce it, said, if you don't, I'll kill all these people. And like, you go, well, so it's so obvious, right? To not fast that Friday so he doesn't kill the people. But it's not because not fasting that Friday was actually good, but it was good that he intended to save those people more, right? So that's the thing. We live in a messy world, but that's why you need a spiritual father and a good one. That not one is just going to tell you what you want to hear. Yeah, go do whatever you want. That's problematic. But right, so you could actually like discern these things. That's why I wanted to show from the Didache. Let your donation sweat in your hand. We know where to give it. It takes discernment. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be open-handed. That's the ideal. It doesn't mean you shouldn't give to all those who ask. That's the ideal. But you have to show discernment.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the same thing with the mortgage, the house. It is usurious for them to lend you the money. It's bad for you to borrow the money. But the question is this the best of all your decisions where you're actually doing more good by doing it? The problem is people take the exception and turn it to the rule. That's the danger, right? And which I think as Orthodox we should never do, because that's like the rule of all Western theology and why they always go wrong. Don't ever take what's exceptional and make it normative. What's normative is that it would be bad, and you got to really work these things out with a spiritual father.
Yeah.
Now we have a good comment. So many churches are run like businesses nowadays that could take focus off the Lord, and that's true. They got church growth seminars for stuff, and it's like, you're not good unless you're growing. And like, what happened to like, we're saving souls? You could have the biggest church in the world, but like people are faithless or they fall away, or you have wrong doctrine, so it's of no avail to them. We need to worry about being obedient. But let's take it out to church. Same with your family. Run your family that way, right? Run your family and trust God with the consequences. If I'm obedient and I'm open-handed, God will provide for my kids in their education. They'll provide for us in a home, right? Yeah. And it's tough. I'm not going to say, look at me, I'm the example. I try for this stuff. It's almost like I got to speak my way up to do it, to jump off the ledge, so to say.
Yeah.
We have to trust in God to provide in these things. Now we got Tony G. Sounds like Tony G, like a guy who plays the flute or something. Kenny G. Hello, brother. I'm a Roman Catholic, currently considering Orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox New Covenant has interpretations that have me convinced. I'm like kind of translating to English. My question is, will we be welcomed as Hispanics? Now, Ben, I'll let you give answer the question, and then I'll answer.
Yeah, I will say 100% you will be welcome into the church. Absolutely, no question. That's just, we're the church for all people. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your ethnicity is. This is why we call ourselves the Orthodox Catholic Church. We are the church according to the whole. There's actually very rich theology that I could go way into about why God created different nations and different races, and that he wants us to dwell as a unity in distinction because he himself is a unity in distinction. Father, Son, Holy Spirit is one nature, etc. It is our glory that we get to share our faith with other cultures. We get to incorporate other cultures into the faith without obscuring the faith, without being a detriment to the faith. So yes, you will absolutely be welcomed as a Hispanic into the church. With that said, however, it depends on where you go as well, how friendly people are going to be. I was blessed in my own experience is that I was greatly, warmly welcomed into the church at my home parish. My parish is mostly full of converts, so it's a lot of people. We're just very accepting to all different kinds of people. We have, we really don't even have like any like Russians or Arabs or Greeks. It's pretty much all like Hispanics, Germans, Europeans. Yes, to put it shortly, you will be welcome in the church.
Yeah, there's good parishes and bad parishes. Also, some ethnic stereotypes kind of are true. Like, Arabs are generally very like welcoming and warm, hospitable people. For example, Greeks are often the same way. So like you will feel just like without just the strangers more welcome there. While like, if you go to some, let's say a church in the Slavonic services, like I'm using stereotypes, by the way. Danbury, Connecticut's Ukrainian church. They're very welcoming Hispanics. Shout out to Father Luke down there. But that aside, it's like they're not that warm with each other. So it's not like personal to you. They're not that warm to you. I would say, to be honest, Orthodox aren't so much like what you think white, black sort of racist, but there's a more anti-Semitism in Orthodoxy stereotypically. So like you can't be like surprised to just hear some sort of Jewish comment. And I think it comes from people from countries where that's not like a stigma, right? So that's part of that. And the other thing is we have to remember, you can't go to the church and go, I'm Hispanic and I'm used to this culture, or I'm Italian or American, I'm used to this, but I don't want to become Greek to be Christian. I don't become Russian. I don't think people realize you're not really becoming Russian when you go to a Russian Orthodox church, or Greek and go to Greek Orthodox church. You're actually becoming a Hellenized Jew with a Greek or Russian flavor. Orthodox worship is really Hellenistic Judaism with its fulfillment in Christ. That's why we have menorahs and stuff, and it's highly liturgical. So it's like, really, it seems foreign to you culturally because it's 2,000 years removed. So you'll feel weird. It only feels normal to the Russian or Greek because they grew up with it. It's not because it's actually Russian or Greek. You go to Russia or Greece, their whole society is very different than their church. So it's something to keep in mind. It will be foreign, but not for reasons you think. It's foreign because you're taking something from 2,000 years ago and letting it live. It will just have a Russian flavor or whatnot. And shout out to Romanians. Yes, they're very nice. Just be sure to know that they won't commune you unless you confess before the liturgy. They're Slavic, even though they speak Romanian in their practices. So just keep that in mind. And it's an interesting thing. In some ways, Orthodoxy, right? Like Roman Catholicism, Protestantism could become very American. It could become very Mexican. It could become very Brazilian. It could become very South Korean. It morphs to its society. Orthodoxy does it in its own way, but it doesn't lose its like authentic elements, which is why it always feels foreign everywhere in that sense. So, but we can see that as a good thing, actually. So he blesses us, and he'll be you're in for a treat if you're going to Father Josiah Trenham. That's like you're going to the Orthodox mega church. So God bless you. So I want to end the show with, if this has blessed you, please bless someone else. You go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. 100% of the donations go to the churches in Cambodia. They're actually in somewhat dire financial straits. And giving has been sort of down. And to be honest, my own personal giving's been down simply because I haven't had the time to like go to MoneyGram and stuff. And it was Christmas and I sent money to other stuff. I let them know about that. But apparently they're getting tough. It's getting tough for them with money. And they actually closed down the ko-fi.com account. So if you're using that to send monthly contributions, sadly that's now closed. You'll have to use orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. I really hope people answer this call simply because it's becoming kind of dire. Dire in that, like, if they're closing down accounts and they're stopping the translations and works, what I don't want them to lose is the parish in Sim Reap. It's only $300 a month, so please consider supporting that. But again, it's like I said, it's not for me. And ultimately, maybe Church of Cambodia isn't your thing, or you want to let your donation sweat in your hands until you know where to give it. Well, give it where you know it'll be productive. That's the point, right? It's the whole point of the show. Give it to your local monastery where they're praying and they're interceding, and pilgrims go there and they grow closer to God. To your parish, your church's got to grow. Give it to them. Don't be afraid to be open-handed, because what will happen is God will bless you, right? God is going to take care of you. So don't worry about that. It doesn't have to be churches in Cambodia, but I do want to, shout them out, so I do every show. Is there anyone particular you want to plug, Ben?
I don't really have a charity organization that I'm affiliated with. So I guess just my own website and stuff is the only thing I really have to plug. But
so
actually,
what's that website name again? I forget.
It's ancientinsights.wordpress.com.
All right, so that's ancientinsights.wordpress.com. I hope you guys check it out. I'm trying to see if they have. I just want to show people something. I'm hoping Father Pisces does a recorded message for us soon. But I'm going to share a screen of something here so people know, I'm not some sort of huckster. I was surprised by this because I didn't know Father Pisces did this. But if you actually go to the website for the Cambodian church, look. He actually used my secular name. He knows my Orthodox name. It's Patrick. That's not hidden. But so you can also use PayPal service, as Cambodian banks don't have the service of cashing PayPal funds. Donations trough through the service are received by our friend Craig Julie, subsequently uses other ways to send us money, called MoneyGram. And it links to orthodoxchristiantheology.com. So it's just so you know, that's how we're working with the Church of Cambodia, right there on their website. Let me just scroll to the top, people, so it's not crazy. There you go. Totally official. You see the Russian. What is that website? It's orthodoxchurchcambodia.org, English version donations. It's linked to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate if you want more information. So that's pretty much it today. I'm really appreciative for you, Ben, coming on tonight and fleshing out this issue, because it's a practical pastoral issue. It's interesting. It's not talked about enough because we just take it for granted. Our churches take out loans. We take out loans. Everyone takes out loans. We forget that it's evil. And we can't forget this. We have to remember that we are the church of the fathers in the scriptures. We affirm what the church has always taught. Doesn't mean the church is perfect. We were talking about how the Russian church sells cigarettes. The Jerusalem Patriarchate is a landlord, and so they have renters and stuff. The church has sometimes done not so great things for money. So usuries existed, simonies existed. We can't say nothing bad's ever happened in church history. It's not the point. But we can affirm what the Orthodox doctrine always was, what the church has always affirmed. And I think you did a real good job fleshing that out for us this evening.
Thank you. I was happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I hope you come on more often. In fact, I hope you take over the show so I don't have to do it anymore.
You know what? We'll just have to see.
We'll have to see. So anyway, I'm going to end the show. I end all my shows. Fight the death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. As Jesus Rock says, God bless you all. Have a good night.